1. Atlantis and Egypt. In modern times, the story of Atlantis has attracted an enormous literature, much of it highly speculative in nature, to use a fairly polite expression. The popularity of the theme is due to several attractive elements. There is the element of a mystery, which still persists. Omni ignotum pro magnifica, as Tacitus once remarked. There is something splendid about everything that is unknown, and there the mystery concerns an island continent which has vanished forever. Moreover, Atlantis was an island which enshrined human ideals, so that its mystery is fused with a sense of longing. In addition, the theme has an eternal quality in that it exhibits several problems which remain unsolved and are likely to remain so even after the completion of this paper. For example, where was Atlantis? What is the origin and meaning of its name? Is the story fact or fiction? Did Plato invent it? What I propose to examine is the possibility that some elements may relate to an Egyptian background or to Egyptian etymologies. Such an inquiry is evidently legitimized by Plato's account of the origin of the story in his Timaeus and Critias. He tells us that its earliest Greek source was the Athenian statesman Solon, who heard the story during his travels in Egypt. It was a very old priest in the city of Sais who related it to him. When Solon arrived at this city, we are told in the Timaeus that he was much honored by the inhabitants, who were very friendly to the Athenians. Plato also states that the Scytes worshipped the goddess Neith, whom they equated with Athena. It was in conversation with the priest that Solon came to discuss antiquity, including both Greek and Egyptian traditions. In the comparison that follows, the Egyptian priest ascribes priority in time to Athens, dating its rise to 9,000 years later. This is apparently an Egyptian gesture of courtesy, and it conflicts with Plato's statement in the Laws, 656e, that in Egypt certain temple inscriptions and figures go back 10,000 years, and also with earlier dictum of the same priest. You Greeks are always children, and there is no such thing as an old Greek, a saying which he then explains as meaning, you are all young in mind. But in a further comment he says, you do not hold in your minds any belief that is ancient through early tradition, or any knowledge that is hoary with age. So the contrast is partly based, after all, on the antiquity of Egypt. Parallels in early Athens and Egypt. The Scyte priest then mentions a parallel in the social order of the two countries. A separation of classes, he says, is observed, and he names these as priests, artisans, craftsmen, who include shepherds, hunters and farmers, and soldiers. Here the rigidity of the division is characteristically Platonic and corresponds with what concerned him especially in the Politeia, where the classes of the ideal state are more theoretically divided into guardians, auxiliaries, and producers. Division of labor is a guiding principle. The same social elements were obviously present in Egypt, but the Egyptians were not given to such theorizing, although the satire of the trades does show a keen consciousness of the distinctions between various occupations. Elsewhere, in the Politicus, 290 DE, Plato shows an interest in the relationship between priesthood and kings in Egypt and seems to refer to a special case such as that of Haremheb, a general who became king after assuming religious functions. Plato's suggestion of a carefully segregated priestly caste in Egypt is, of course, unfounded, although the hereditary principle did eventually become prominent. Nor was it the case in Greece. The contrast may therefore be the result of pursuit of opposites in the manner of Herodotus. When Plato mentions the Egyptian emphasis on learning based on theology and cosmology, and embracing divination, medicine and health, he is again probably following Herodotus, 83 and 84, who says that in Egypt all divination is placed under the control of certain gods, and that in medicine there are no general practitioners, all medical men being specialist. It seems then that Plato here is not following any direct observations made to Solon by an Egyptian priest, but prefers to use well-known material already available in a written source. It is a tendency often attested in the annals of literature, both ancient and modern. Did Solon's visit occur? A question which must evidently be faced is the historicity of Solon's visit to Egypt. Even if that is established, the historicity of Atlantis does not necessarily follow. Imagination and experience are categories distinct from history. But if the story of Atlantis is placed even in these categories, it does matter whether we can, or cannot, trust the tradition that Solon went to Egypt and had conversed there with learned priest. It is true that it is only in later sources that lavish details first emerge about the visit, in Plutarch's Life of Solon and in the treatise of Diogenes Laertius on the lives of the philosophers. We have also to be on our guard against the Greek tendency, arising from a too fervent veneration of Egyptian antiquity, to embellish the career of their early philosophers and sages with impressive visits to Egypt. Yet the rather facile skepticism with which Hopfner and others have lumped all these instances, presented by ancient tradition, into the same boat and promptly allowed it to sink, must also be rejected. The sound approach is to consider each case on its own merits. In the case of Solon's visit, we have the evidence of Diodorus Siculus, under 69, 77, 79, 96, and 98, who was writing in the 1st century BC. We also have the important early evidence of Herodotus, who mentions it twice, 130 and 177. In his first mention, 130, he says that Solon went to Egypt to the court of Amasis and borrowed from him the idea of an annual income tax. Not a very cheerful Egyptianism, enacting then a law in Athens too, which compelled every citizen to declare his source of income annually. Here there is a chronological difficulty, since Solon's archonship is usually dated to 594 BC, whereas the reign of Amasis did not begin till 570 BC. A minority of scholars, admittedly, would date Solon's legislation to a date much later than his archonship. But an anachronism emerges also in the account given by Herodotus of how Solon, after visiting Egypt, went to Sardis and there consulted King Croesus. The temptation thus arises, because of two likely anachronisms, to reject the whole tradition that Solon went to Egypt, following the specious rule of si in uno, sic in omnibus. Such an approach, it should be noted, would vitiate even the claim that Herodotus visited Egypt, for his account contains several blunders, the most notorious of which is to place the pharaohs who built the pyramids immediately after Rameses III. Clearly, such errors do not suffice to establish that Herodotus should be rejected in toto, including the claim that he visited Egypt. The strongest evidence for Solon's visit is that one of his poems was concerned with Egypt, just as elsewhere he writes of Cyprus, and no one ventures to deny the visit to Cyprus. It is Plutarch in his Life of Solon, 26, who quotes a line from the poem on Egypt, and he expressly connects it with Solon's visit to the country. The line gives topographical allusion on the Nile's outpourings near the Canopic shore. Plutarch goes on to say that Solon spent some time in intellectual converse with Xenophis the Heliopolitan and Sonches the Sate, who were very learned priests, and that it was from these that he heard the story of Atlantis. The Atlantic story is the expression used. De Moulinaire realizes the crucial import of the quotation from Solon himself, clinching as it does the force of the many other allusions to the tradition about Solon's visit. At the same time, he is careful to add his view that the alleged meeting with Amasis is chronologically impossible. And he also rejects the alleged Egyptian origin of the law of idleness ascribed to Solon. The visit is therefore accepted as historical, in spite of the rejection of some relevant details. It is true that the quotation from Solon's poem consists of only one line, although Plutarch is very explicit about its source and context. In such a firmly attested association, one line is as good as 50, and a crassly quantifying approach is misplaced. The priestly names and status. Plutarch mentions the names of two priests. They do not occur in Herodotus, and this in itself is an indication that Plutarch was not entirely dependent on the earlier historians. He gives the name of the priest of Heliopolis as Xenophis, variant 1, Xenopis. It is a good Egyptian name, probably a transcription of the beautiful sun. As for the priest of Sais, who is credited with the transmission of the story of Atlantis, the name assigned to him by Plutarch is Sonkis. In the life of Solon 26, it is written Sonkis with a long first vowel. In the De Isid et Osirid 10, 354e, it is written Sonkis with a short first vowel. It is the first form with the long first vowel that is reproduced, though with a slightly different ending, by Clement of Alexandria in his Stromates, 1:1569, where he mentions Sonkis the Egyptian, chief prophet. Probably the name is a shortened form of Sesonkis, which Manetho gives as the Greek form of SSNK, Sheshonk, a derivation from SNH, Lepsius, Parthe, Hopfner. He who cars to live is less likely in view of the divergent vocalization that sometimes emanates from this verb. Nor are the forms related to Sukos for Sobek, the crocodile god, close candidates. According to Proclus, who was writing in the 5th century AD in his commentary on the Timaeus, AD 21 EF, the name of the priest of Sais was Paternaet. He also names priest at Heliopolis and Sebenitos. The name Paternaet, which derives from he whom Neith has given, is of course admirably suited to a city where the goddess Neith was the dominant deity. The name given by Plutarch is a good deal earlier in origin, but it would be a rather optimistic act to accept even that as of likely validity in relation to a priestly name that revests to the early 6th century BC. A. E. Taylor maintained that these names and other details merely show that in Alexandrian and post-Alexandrian times, Greek writers knew the meaning of a few Egyptian names. His comment betrays a severe underestimation of the Greek understanding of such matters in that age. Plutarch certainly had access to many Egyptian names, as the De Isid et Osirid amply bears out, and apart from the names, he there provides more than 30 linguistic references to Egyptians. In spite of this plenitude, it would be rash to assume that he has correctly transmitted the name of the site priest who talked to Solon. On the other hand, there is every likelihood that Sonkis was the name of an Egyptian priest at some time or other. There now arises the more general question of whether Solon in Egypt was likely to have access to priests of important standing. In the case of Herodotus, more than a century later, it is widely agreed that this was not so. He too, by the way, claimed to have spoken to a priestly functionary at Sais, whom he entitles the scribe of the sacred treasury of Athena, the goddess denoted being, of course, Neith. The post was probably a lesser one, although an Egyptian title like SSPRHDN Nit may well lie behind the Greek phrase. What must have counted a good deal was the difference in social status between Solon and Herodotus. The latter was probably a freelance lecturer, a logopoios, rather than a commercial traveller, whereas Solon was a famous statesman who had ruled an important city-state to which Egypt was friendly. The utopian aspect of Atlantis. When Plato first introduces Atlantis, Timaeus 24-5, it is the impression of size, power, and arrogance that he seeks to convey. It is a huge island, bigger than Libya and Asia together, opposite the Pillars of Heracles, that is, the Straits of Gibraltar today. Before this, the priest has been lauding the glories of Athens. He says that the goddess Athena has there produced men of great intelligence. She is herself said to be a lover of war and wisdom. A strange combination, almost a contradiction in terms, but suited to Athena Promachos and the patroness of skill in craft. And so her city, Athens, was likely to produce men of similar caliber. The priest goes on to praise Athens for repelling a great power which once set out from the Atlantic Ocean to advance arrogantly against the whole of Europe and Asia. Although the geographic roles are reversed, this tale of two cities seems to echo the success of Athens in repelling the imperial might of Persia. Certainly Plato's picture of the capital city of Atlantis and its surroundings seems to owe a good deal to the descriptions given by Herodotus of Ecbatana, capital of the Median Empire, and of Babylon under Assyrian rule. Ecbatana, for instance, is said to have walls of great size and strength, rising in circles one within the other, and different colors of material are said to be used. Similar features are assigned to the capital of Atlantis. With the description of urban sophistication, wealth, and imperial power comes an emphasis on technology. Various stones and metals are said to have been mined, and the metals include a special and distinctive one called Orechalkos, whose name alone has survived, but which was then regarded, we are told, as the most precious of metals, apart from gold. Since the metal is mentioned in the Homeric hymns 6.9, its presence in Atlantis contributes to the archaic flavor. Its name means mountain copper, or mountain bronze. We might recall the fact that in Egyptian, the determinative for sandy hill country is sometimes found in connection with bi3 and related expressions, as in bi3, with the sense of mine. But a link with Orechalkos, apart from the semantic parallel, is quite unlikely. Plato dwells on the abundance of timber in Atlantis and on the richness and variety of animal life, which includes the elephant. He becomes fervent in his picture of the plentiful natural products of the island. In addition to this, whatever aromatic substances the earth now bears, in the form of roots or plants or trees of gums exuded from flowers or fruits, these were produced and nourished well. Cultivated crops too, both the dry sort which serves our nutrition and the other kinds which we use for provision. And we call all these elements pulse, were produced, and there were fruits of trees, giving drink, food and oil, which are hard to store but give us amusement and pleasure, and which we offer after supper as welcome refreshment and stimulants of appetite. All these were produced in wonderfully fine quality and endless profusion by the holy island, which then lay under the sun. Critias, 115 A.B. Some of these sentences are rather difficult. The desert fruit referred to may include the olive, the pomegranate, and the lemon. Nuts also, but not the coconut. Plato ends the passage with a serenely simple statement. The wonderful profusion belonged to an island, which then lay under the sun. The force of the past tense is clearly to remind us that the island no longer exists. It has vanished beneath the waves. To him, it remains a holy island. The description quoted is reminiscent of the island portrayed in The Shipwrecked Sailor, for this too is an island blessed by nature's beneficence. Although it is a disastrous shipwreck that brings the sailor to it, his first sight of it is a picture of blissful abundance. I found there figs and grapes, all manner of fine vegetables, sycamore figs, some unnotched and others notched, and cucumbers as if they were cultivated. Fish and fowl were there. There exists nothing that was not in it. I had my fill and left some of the ground, because I had too much in my grasp. A.M. Bachman, Middle Egyptian Stories. 1. Brussels, 1932, 43, lines 47 and 54. Later, the sailor is told by the serpent deity of the island that myrrh and hekenu oil abound there, and when the sailor's departure is imminent, the divine serpent presents him with many varied gifts. Then he gave me a load of myrrh, hekenu oil, laudanum, rennet spice, Tishepsis spice, perfume, eye paint, giraffes' tails, masses of incense, elephants' tusks, greyhounds, long-tailed monkeys, baboons, and all kinds of splendid things. Ibid, 46F, lines 162-5. Evidently, there are similar elements in the two idyllic portrayals. There is the same emphasis on the profusion provided by nature, and in the products named there is the same prominence for aromatic substances, and even Plato's elephants are present in the Egyptian counterpart, or at least their tusks. We have noted that Plato's island, in this context, is a holy island. In the Egyptian story there is a strikingly parallel phrase, the divine serpent urges the sailor not to be afraid and goes on like this. Look, it is a god that has allowed you to live and brought you to this island of the Ka. There exists nothing that is not in it. It is full of all splendid things. Ibidon 44, lines 113, 116. This island of the Ka was once translated by Gardner as Phantom Island, but Goedicke has rightly questioned this somewhat romantic rendering. The word K3 is usually applied to a person. It refers to a man's double, but scarcely to any sort of phantom. Ehrman at first rendered the phrase Dies Insel mit Nahrung, although he later had doubts about this. Goedicke's solution is fairly radical. He separates NK from IWPN and begins a new sentence with it, adding a suffix pronoun, "For thy K3, there is nothing that is not in it." In this way, the phrase is treated rather ungrammatically without any syntactical relationship with what precedes or follows. The rendering by Emma Brunnertraut has the merit of agreeing fully with the sense of the context. Zu dieser Insel der Paradiesesfülle. To this island of paradise plenty. Here, the meaning of abundance in the material sense is probably not divorced from its religious source, for the abundance stems from a God-given life force. The dominating figure on this island is, of course, the serpent, and his first appearance and later function indicate his divine nature. His body, we're told, was overlaid with gold, and his eyebrows were of real lapis lazuli, 64.4f. And divine attributes are readily recognizable here, as also in the awe-inspiring effect he had on the sailor, and especially in his appalling threat of having the sailor reduced to ashes. Hardly a natural faculty of the most powerful serpent. Yet his family story, with its total of 75 serpents, all wiped out, apart from himself, by a falling star, is touchingly removed from the divine sphere. By way of contrast, Plato's Atlantis is gleamingly marked out as a holy island by virtue of the claim that, when the gods divided the whole earth between them, the island of Atlantis fell to the lot of Poseidon. This god, we are told, married an earth-born mortal woman named Clito. They produced 5 pairs of male twins, and the island was distributed into 10 parts and allotted to the 10 sons, who became kings of these regions, but with the eldest son, Atlas, as overlord, Critias, 113-114. The first rulers of Atlantis, then, were all of divine origin as sons of Poseidon, and the idea of divine sanction is frequent in Greek descriptions of an early blissful society, beginning with Hesiod's portrait of the golden race, Works and Days, 109 FF. According to him, that age of primitive innocence was the result of the creation of the golden race by the gods themselves. And these people lived like gods. Hesiod's schema was probably not Greek in origin, but one borrowed from Iranian sources. The Egyptian tradition, however, comes still closer to the idea of divine rulers as found in Plato's Atlantis. It was a tradition which envisaged the primitive era of happiness as one when the gods ruled among men as the earliest kings. Thus, Manetho's earliest dynasties are divine, and so are those of the Turin royal canon. And there is plentiful evidence in other Egyptian sources of the same idea, witnessed by phrases referring to the rule of Re and Osiris, and to the importance of Maat. It seems possible, then, that the Egyptian tradition of blissful divine rule is reflected in one aspect of Atlantis, an oasis island paradise like Egypt. It is also possible that the shipwrecked sailor, and stories like it, and we may assume that there were others, may have influenced the element of simple utopianism in Plato's Atlantis, although it is a far cry from the sophisticated megalopolis which is also prominent in Plato's picture. One of the first of modern writers to invoke the relevance of the Egyptian story to Atlantis was the late Spiridon Marinatos, who elaborated the theory initiated by K.T. Frost, which saw Cretan civilization as being basically identical with that of Atlantis. In this theory, the collapse of the Minoan Crete is linked to the volcanic eruption of Thera, Santorini, in about 1600 BC. It is rather strange that in a discussion which refers a good deal to Egyptian evidence, Marinatos gives very little attention to the aspects mentioned above. What strikes him as the common denominator is the cataclysmic factor. In The Shipwrecked Sailor, there are several incidents of doom and gloom, either experienced or threatened. Apart from the shipwreck itself, which is the result of a storm, the huge serpent who encounters the sailor menaces him with swift destruction which will reduce him to ashes, unless he quickly explains who brought him to the island, being the Nile oasis in the shape of a serpent. Later, the serpent relates his family history. The happy family of 75 came to a sudden end, save for the serpent himself. Then a star fell, and they went up in flames because of it. 129 or 130. The first part of this statement is exceptionally problematic, and I do not propose to discuss it here. Later, the serpent makes a dire prophecy about the fate of the island. But it shall come about, when thou art parted from this place, that never shalt thou see this island again, for it will become water. Ebid, 153, 154. Clearly its end is like that of Atlantis, and this cataclysm has been dealt with by geologists in a wealth of analysis and parallelism, the main analogies adduced being Thera, Santorini. Possible historical echoes. Plato's account of Atlantis culminates in the conflict on a grand scale between Atlantis on the one hand and Athens and Egypt on the other, although all the Mediterranean countries east of the Pillars of Heracles are included in the second group. In this struggle, Atlantis is defeated, but the ensuing volcanic cataclysm engulfs both Athens and Atlantis. It seems that Max Pieper was the scholar who first suggested that this account may include a reminiscence of the struggle conducted successfully by Rameses III against the Sea People. A delta city such as Sais might well have preserved the memory of that fearful attack with some vividness. Atlantis is portrayed by Plato as being principally a naval power, and adherents of the Cretan theory find no difficulty in making Minoan Crete play this aggressive role, although there is little historical evidence to support it. Pieper allows considerable room in Plato's narrative for the kind of transformation or exaggeration found in the embellishments of a poetic or mythic treatment, as in the gigantic numbers provided by him. But he refuses to believe that the whole story was pure invention on his part, even if his originality, including a philosophical interpretation, is stamped upon the eventual presentation. He agrees that the description of the great temple of Atlantis and its divine statues may be influenced by the works of Greek artists, such as Scopas and Phidias, and that the struggle of Persia and Athens may be reflected in the account of the war. Yet a kernel of historical truth in the experience of Egypt is discerned. The invasion and repulsion of the Sea Peoples became the subject of the immensely impressive battle scenes in Medinet Habu, published with suitable elaboration by the Chicago Oriental Institutes. In spite of the element of religious celebration, which marks many pharaonic scenes of this kind, here the validity of the historical detail is for the most part undeniable, since there was no prototype which could have been imitated. This depiction of a naval battle is unique in Egyptian art. Actually, there was an accompanying attack by land, as the inscriptions make clear. It is true that before this, Meremptar had an experience of attacks by both Libyans and peoples of the sea. Under Rameses III, the attacking forces were stronger and more varied, including as they did the Danu, the Peliset, and the Sheklesh, perhaps to be identified with the Greek Danaoi, the Philistines, and the Sicilians. Other attacks took place in northern Palestine and Syria. If we look for similarities between this encounter and that which is ascribed to Atlantis and other powers like the Hittites, the grand scale of the conflict is one common feature. Further, the Tyrannoi seems to feature in both accounts. Plato says, Timaeus 25a, that Atlantis controlled Libya up to the borders of Egypt and Europe as far as Tyrrhenia. The Greeks used this last name to denote Etruria, or central Italy. Here the meaning may extend to Italy as a whole. In the inscriptions of Rameses III, peoples invading from the north are said to include the Turusa, grouped with the Sakalusa, as enemies of Libya, and the form approaches the Greek variant Tirsinoi, which occurs in the Homeric hymn to Dionysus, 7.8. But there, the name is unlikely to have any Etruscan or Italian connotation and refers probably to Pelasgian, or non-Hellenic people, in Greek lands. The Etruscans, in any case, are traditionally regarded as reaching Italy not before the 8th century BC, and the victory of Rameses III is dated to the early 12th century. This does not rule out, of course, that the Tarusa mentioned by him were then still resident in Asia Minor. No exact correspondence emerges, therefore, from the rebuttal of the Sea Peoples. Plato himself, it should be noted, varies his emphasis somewhat. In Timaeus, 24 AFF, he refers to an alliance of the Greeks led by Athens, but also to a later stage when Athens had to fight on her own, achieving a success in which Athens generously brought freedom to all other living within the Pillars of Heracles. The role of Athens in repelling the Persians is clearly reflected here. But geographically, the western location of Atlantis prevents an equation of Atlantis and Persia, unless there are two pillars being denoted. Indeed, in Critias, 108 EE, reference is made to a declaration of war between those who dwelt beyond and outside the Pillars of Heracles and all those who dwelt inside them, being the Aegean Sea, and on the eastern side of the Straits of Gibraltar. A maritime power in the western Mediterranean, the Atlantic Sea, recalls Carthage, which was founded as a colony of Tyre, probably in the 8th century, and gradually established a monopoly of trade in the whole region. And the elephants of Atlantis could also be traced there. But the forces on the other side varied, and the struggle of Carthage was directed at first against the Greeks, especially in Sicily. In about 535 BC, a Greek move westwards was repelled by combined Carthaginian and Etruscan fleets. However, Egypt, the island paradise, does not figure in such situations, and a distinctive feature of Plato's account is an alliance of Egypt and Athens against an invader, possibly the Hittites. It was one thought that in an earlier period, the Cretans or an Aegean people had helped the Egyptians to expel the Hyksos from their country. But this idea has long since been rejected. It was in the Site era that the pharaohs relied heavily on the help of the Ionian Greeks, and it is fair to emphasize, as does Marinatos, that the Athenians were Ionians. However, it was in their struggle against Persia that the Egyptians were closely in league, for a time, with the Athenians' stricto sensu. After the murder of Xerxes and the accession of Artaxerxes I, in 465 BC, a revolt against the Persians was led by Inaros in the northwestern delta. He succeeded in establishing control over the whole delta, and then, fearing the Persian backlash, invoked the aid of the Athenians, who helped him to capture the larger part of Memphis. Later, the Persians regained the supremacy, and although the Egyptians' revolt was revived under Amateus, who was summoned Athenian aid, resistance eventually petered out. If we ask whether Plato was recalling this concerted action of Egypt and Athens, we must concede that he was greatly interested in the clash which promised to bring about the end of Persian domination. Perhaps the sense of friendly cooperation between Egypt and Athens enters into his account as history rhyming with the Trojan Wars told by Homer. Although the particular episode of Persia was too insignificant to colour the broad picture. Later, of course, Egypt welcomed Alexander as the conqueror who freed her from the Neo-Atlantean yoke, but that even was post-Platonic. Polity and religion. Reverting to the descriptive passages concerned with the inner life of Atlantis, in our search for possible Egyptian analogies, we find that a good deal of attention is given to a system of irrigation planned by the state. After referring to the fiery disaster which attended the attempt made by Phaethon, child of the sun, to drive his father's chariot, the Egyptian priest tells Solon, "For us, however, the Nile is in general our saviour and saves us from this disaster when its flow is released." This comes in the section dealing with a broad comparison of Egypt and Athens. I have translated the manuscript reading as "when its flow is released," taking the participle as passive. The Nile inundation occurs in the hot season, and the release of its flow probably includes a reference to the use of planned irrigation. A little later, the priest says, 22e, that in Egypt, water never falls on the land from above, but rises up naturally from below, a clear reference to the general absence of rain and the fertilizing power of the river. The irrigating process also meant, of course, that the dangers of flooding could be mitigated. All this is a true reflection of Egypt, but is it found also in the picture of Atlantis? We have seen that the description of its capital city, with its concentric water rings, seems to derive from what Herodotus says about Persian and Babylonian capitals. Plato states that a canal connected the outer ring of water with the sea. This would scarcely suit either Ecbatana or Babylon, and could not apply to any pre-Alexandrian Egyptian city, unless one has yet to be discovered possible under Cairo, for the Egyptian hieroglyph for city is denoted as a circle, but Atlantis is an island. Yet the Egyptian system of irrigation did pay considerable attention to the conditions of towns, and defensive dikes were sometimes built to prevent their being endangered. The largest plain of Atlantis is described as being irrigated by a complex system of channels or canals. Critias, 118 CD, one series running north to south, and another providing cross channels. A feature of this system is said to be the use of transport by water, including the floating of timber from the mountains and also the movement of agricultural produce. But fertilizing power was the main goal. 2 harvests a year were possible, we are told, one in winter dependent on rainfall, and one in summer through the irrigation provided by the channels which were supplied by the rivers. Here is a picture which may well be colored by Egyptian experience. It is true that the big river valleys of either Egypt or Mesopotamia could have provided the model of such irrigation, but the complexity and regularity of the system favored an Egyptian analogy. Another contender is the plain of Messara in southern Crete, which extended north of Phaistos. But a detail which again favors Egypt is the emphasis on transport by water, which was regularly carried out not only on the Nile, but on many subsidiary canals. The timber available in Egypt included that from the acacia, the date palm, the dom palm, and the sycamore. As for the 2 harvests mentioned by Plato, the winter harvest resulting from rainfall was obviously not an Egyptian detail, unless we are only talking about the Delta region. But the general suggestion of exceptional fertility was part of a widely accepted and largely valid belief. This fertility in Atlantis is presented as the result, mainly, of intensive and systematic irrigation, and is obviously at variance with the idyllic picture of natural abundance which Plato provides in the Timaeus. The contrast exemplifies the fact that quite disparate elements have gone to make up his composite portrayal. It is significant, at the same time, that in this case both elements may well derive from Egypt, although neither derivation seems hitherto to have been recognized. If we turn to consider the political makeup of Atlantis, we find that Plato gives few details in the Timaeus. He does refer there, 25a, to a great and remarkable dynasty of kings, which ruled the whole island and also many other regions. In the Critias, 113 BFF, he gives much more detail, stating that the 10 rulers were sons of Poseidon and Clito, and that they comprised 5 pairs of twins, the island of Atlantis being divided among the 10 in such a way as to give the biggest and best share to the elder member of the eldest pair of twins. He is established as king over the others, while these are made governors, each being assigned numerous subjects and extensive territory. The first king, we are told, was called Atlas, and he had a long line of successors, the rule of succession being that the eldest son took the place of the previous eldest son. Here we note an emphasis once more on primogeniture. Later, 119c, the 10 are called kings, and each is said to enjoy full power in his own region and city over both people and laws, including the right of punishment and death. The division of power among the 10 and their relationship with one another are matters said to be settled by religious sanction, the commands of Poseidon, and they are described in inscriptions, it is said, made by the first kings and engraved on a pillar in the Temple of Poseidon. Every 5th or 6th year, the 10 kings are said to meet to discuss matters of mutual concern and also to pronounce judgment on any wrong perpetrated by any of them. To Plato's first Athenian readers, such a political system would undoubtedly have appeared strange. In Greek experience, the word dynasty now had an archaic ring, since monarchy was a phase they had long since parted with. It had merely a vestigial sense in the term king, the second of the city-state's rulers. On the other hand, in a Persian context, the term was real and vivid, since the Persian Empire was ruled by a king who liked to style himself the Great King or the King of Kings. It has indeed been suggested that Plato is trying to evoke not so much the small world of the Greek city-states as the universe of Oriental despotism. Yet, what strikes one about the polity of Atlantis is that it combines monarchic rule with regional autonomy, allowing full consultation on the level of central and regional authority, consultation, by the way, which concerns only the rulers and not at all the citizens ruled by them, thus showing the absence of any Greek democratic ideas. If one looks for parallels in ancient political systems, it is apparent that Egypt provides one that is basically close, since that country was divided into nomes, each with its nomarch. Although the power of the pharaoh, ruling from his capital city, was overwhelmingly strong, authority in various spheres was decentralized to the nome rulers, this simple generalization being open to much modification in a huge expanse of history. The parallel is clearer if we accept Plato's first statement about the titles used in Atlantis. There is only one king, and the 9 regional rulers are called governors. It was in the Old and Middle Kingdoms that the system of nomarchs flourished, with considerable variation of power and title. By the end of the Middle Kingdom, the system was giving way to one in which the city, rather than the nome, was the unit of decentralized power. But in the Third Intermediate Period, there was a revival of the earlier order, and Assurbanipal refers to nome rulers as kings, Sarani. At the beginning of the Site period, when Psammetichus I ruled again over an independent and united Egypt, the pharaoh's capital was Sais. But he had succeeded in reconciling to his rule the leaders of important regional centers, especially at Tanis, Heracleopolis, and Thebes. It was far from being a uniform pattern, and it is clear that Plato, even if his ultimate inspiration here was Egypt, has produced for Atlantis in this matter, as in others, a highly systematized blueprint which did not exactly correspond to any historical reality. It is relevant to recall at the same time that in the Phaedrus, 274d, Plato refers to a king of all Egypt ruling from Thebes. He calls this king Thamus and correctly names the god of Thebes as Ammon. Further, in the Laws, 656 df, he presents a well-informed view of Egyptian art. Indeed, a recent translator of the Laws declares that Plato shows considerable knowledge of Egypt, and it is more than likely that he visited the country and knows what he is talking about. To see an Egyptian coloring in the political system of Atlantis has not occurred to others, who favor a mainly Egyptian source. It must be admitted that there are other possibilities in systems that combined strong centralism with a measure of delegated power. Thus, Darius I divided the Persian Empire into 20 provinces and placed a satrap in charge of each. These satraps were nominated by him and directly responsible to him. The difference in Egypt and Atlantis is that there the division is within a country, or dare I say an island, and not an empire. Unless Plato is taking Herodotus's account of the legend of Sesostris, a possible conflation with the Hittites. Later, the Assyrians in Egypt had made use of local governors and petty princes, but this too was an imperial plan. Carthage, on the other hand, had a mixed constitution admired by the Greeks, but the powers of the Suffet, Sephardic Hebrew Shophet, judge, leader, had parallels in Rome rather than Atlantis. Better pointers to Carthage are the elephants, the triremes, the harbour works, and the wealth in metals. and the name of one of the 10 kings, Gaderos, clearly based on the Phoenician city of Gadara, Gades, in southwestern Spain. One might perhaps argue that the 10 kings are a group transferred from the 9 archons of Athens with an overlord added. But in Atlantis, the division is not of function within the whole state, but of the terrain in a larger country, and this is closer to the Egyptian system. Nor are the independent city-states of Sumeria analogous. In Crete also, the monarchy disappeared early, and the chief officials of the aristocratic city-states were called kosmoi. While Ephorus and Aristotle state that there were 10 kosmoi in each Cretan city, thus producing an exact parallel, inscriptions indicate a smaller number. For an earlier period, a system of independent states may be inferred, with Knossos in a position of primacy, and yet only primus inter pares. There is no resemblance here to the polity of Atlantis. In both Egypt and Atlantis, there is one supreme sovereign, and certainly the Egyptian term enestude tibit was not used of an office which was on par with any other. Plato describes, Critias 119 EF, the cohesion of the Atlantid state being solemnly expressed in an elaborate ceremony in which mutual pledges are given by the 10 rulers, and an oath is said to be engraved on the pillar which contains the inscription of the law. The oath threatens curses on those who disobey the inscription. In the concomitant ceremony, the 10 rulers hunt for a bull using clubs and ropes, but no metal weapon. When a bull is caught, he is sacrificed, and his blood poured over the inscription on the pillar. The rulers make a libation of wine mixed with the blood, pronouncing an oath to give proper judgments according to the laws. Among these laws is one which states that they shall never make war on each other, and in matters of policy will recognize the sovereignty of the house of Atlas, that is, the descendants of the eldest son of Poseidon. It is not surprising that those who believe that Atlantis should be equated with Crete have found plentiful material in Minoan art to illustrate the theme of bull games, which may also have a religious significance. Yet this material does not point to the culminating rite in Plato's account, which is the sacrifice of a bull. And the truth is that such a rite is eminently typical of Egyptian religion, where it was regarded as the most acceptable of offerings. Further, it is only Egyptian religion that presents the king as a deity, Horus, who hunts wild animals, including the wild bull, with the symbolical meaning that they represent his enemy, Seth. Rameses III is thus shown hunting bulls in a relief on the first pylon at Medinet Habu, though he is certainly not without a metal weapon, for from his chariot he is aiming a long lance at the bull. Earlier texts and representations show the royal hunter with the lasso, or with bow and arrow. Another Egyptian detail occurs in the reference made previously, Critias 116c, to the procreation and conception of the divine kings of Atlantis in a shrine of Poseidon and Cleito within the royal palace. This recalls the New Kingdom theology of the divine king, which is set out textually and pictorially on the walls of temples at Luxor and Deir el-Bahari, although the act of generation, or even a dramatic presentation of it, was probably not performed in the temples themselves. Apart from these specific parallels, it is evident that Plato's whole account of the role of the 10 kings derives from Egypt, and more precisely from a tradition promulgated by the Greek community in Egypt concerning the accession of Psammetichus, the first to control of a united Egypt. This tradition had already been presented by Herodotus, 147, 151, 3, and his account provides servile affinities with that of Plato's Atlantis. Herodotus states that at the time Egypt was divided into 12 districts with 12 kings over them. Plato varies the number to 10. These kings, according to Herodotus, vowed to respect each other's position, and they were all strictly on a par. Plato also stresses their non-aggression pact, but one king is said to enjoy primacy. And this, in fact, is the position eventually achieved by Psammetichus in the account by Herodotus, as prophesied by an oracle. Again, both accounts highlight the concerted ritual action by the kings. They pour libations together. Herodotus locates this in the temple of Hephaestus, Ptah, though he adds that the kings met also in all the temples. Plato locates it in the temple of Poseidon and adds the detail of mixing the wine with clots of bull's blood. Both writers also mention a sacrifice in the temple. Herodotus makes a high priest conduct the ritual. Plato represents the kings themselves as doing this, a detail closer to Egyptian practice. A fifth parallel is that Psammetichus is said by Herodotus, after achieving the sovereignty, to have made a court for the Apis bull in the temple of Hephaestus in Memphis. Plato says the bulls were roaming free in the temple of Poseidon. In this case, the reference cannot be to the Apis, however, since the hunting of wild bulls is then described. It is fairly clear that the motive of the account in Herodotus is to establish the greater glory of the Greeks. For when Psammetichus has to pour a libation from his bronze helmet, he foreshadows his successful use of the bronze men, that is, the Ionian and Carian mercenaries. This element does not figure in Plato's account, although he does extol, elsewhere, the contribution made by Athens to Egypt in the struggle against Atlantis, possible conflation with the Trojan-Hittite wars. The existence of 10 or 12 or more kings in Egypt before the accession of Psammetichus I is certainly a possibility. Whereas the Greco-Egyptian origin of the religious and political setup in Atlantis may therefore be maintained with some confidence, it is a little disappointing to realize that it is an adaptation of an episode found in Herodotus. Plato was supremely original in many aspects of his thinking, but during his visit to Egypt, he was perhaps content, as my wife suggests to me, to use Herodotus as his Baedeker. Yet his discussions of Egyptian art and education are exceptions of this norm. Numbers and names. It is the advocates of an equation of Crete and Atlantis that have mainly concerned themselves with the high numbers given by Plato. They usually present the view that it is Crete as seen from Egypt that is involved. An island in the west might well mean Crete for an Egyptian. At least it was northwest. From the Greek mainland, however, Crete is an island to the south. An element of exaggeration has been sensed in Plato's descriptions, as when he says, Timaeus 24e, that Atlantis was an island larger than Libya and Asia together. By Libya, he probably means Africa, but no precise knowledge of the size of Africa was then available. In any case, a huge extent of land is meant, and one wonders how the word island was appropriated. One way out of the difficulty is emendation of the text, and P.B.S. Andrews has made the ingenious proposal that we should read midway between, instead of larger. Atlantis then becomes an island midway between Libya and Asia. And this, he argues, would suit Crete perfectly. There is one obvious flaw in the proposal, in that the word together makes no sense with the revised meaning. One cannot speak of being midway between Libya and Asia together. Admittedly, the word does not occur in the parallel phrase in the Critias, 108e, but it is rather too convenient to delete the word in the Timaeus with the suggestion that it is a false gloss of Plato's own. The ingenuity applied to the problem of the high numbers is more impressive. 9,000 years are said to have elapsed since the war between Atlantis and the other countries which include Athens and Egypt. 9,000 years, that is, up to the time of the priest's information to Solon, about 600 BC, Timaeus 23e, Critias 108e. Now, if this figure were 900 instead of 9,000, it would fit in well with the date of about 1600 BC, which is assigned to the catastrophe in Thera, which also brought disaster to Minoan Crete. This would leave an interval of roughly 1,000 years. A similar reduction from thousands to hundreds would likewise make better sense of other figures given by Plato, like those relating to the plain of the royal city, said to be 3,000 by 2,000 stades, Critias 118a, a stade being about 1/8 of a Roman mile. A bright idea occurred to the Greek geologist A.G. Galenopoulos, who would locate the royal city of Atlantis on the south coast of Thera, where remains of a town with many Minoan traits were found buried under volcanic debris. He suggests that, when Solon was transcribing the Egyptian writings, the word or symbol representing 100 was mistaken for the representing 1000. Here, the assumption that Solon produced a manuscript on the subject of Atlantis seems quite justified. For although the Timaeus suggests that it was a story communicated orally to him by an Egyptian priest, the Critias, 113b, refers pointedly to a manuscript entrusted by Solon to the elder Critias, indicating that it was a Greek composition in which Solon had embodied Egyptian material, the suggestion being that it was with the help of a bilingual priest. If we assume a hieroglyphic form of the prototype, there seems to be very scanty ground for the proposal, since the normal forms for 100 and 1000 are so sharply distinguished. 100 Gardner 5, 1, coil of rope. Gardner M, 12 leaf, stack and base of lotus look. However, if a hieratic prototype be assumed, some approximation does occur occasionally. In the third volume of his Hieratische Paleography, Moller records a hieratic form for 500, which is not unlike one for 3000. See his Nos. 636 and 642. There is no systematic approximation. It is true. If hieratic variations might make the argument tempting, there is a statement in another of Plato's works which firmly destroys it. In the Laws, 656e, he also refers to the antiquity of Egyptian civilization when he maintains that works of art in Egypt follow the forms which they had 10,000 years ago. This figure is close to that given in the Timaeus and Critias, and it is highly unlikely that an error in reading Egyptian numerals in the earlier context led to a similarly false figure being incorporated into the later work. The same crucial objection can be raised against the interesting suggestion of Phyllis Forsyth, who thinks that an error of the kind discussed could have occurred in a transcribing of Minoan or Mycenaean records into Egyptian hieroglyphics, since the linear A and B symbol for 100 is a circle, and that for 1000 is a cross in the circle. The two signs are admittedly similar, the one being a circle and the other a circle with short appendages. It is unlikely, on the other hand, apart from the basic objection I have raised, that an extended literary text was ever written in the linear A or B script, with most likely an error coming about in the Middle Ages. If we turn to the names, especially that of the island itself, we find that in the prelude to the account given in the Critias, an explanation is given by Critias as to how Greek names seem to appear in the narrative of Critias, 113 AB. There is an emphasis here on the fact that the names were preserved in writing, and we have noted already that this differs rather from the statement in the Timaeus 26 AB, where the oral telling of the story is dwelt on, and the way in which children are able to recall what they hear. It is amazing, as they say, how the lessons of childhood stick in the memory. The discrepancy, however, does not amount to a flat contradiction, for Critias' passage refers to the memorizing of written material, and this was doubtless done by having it read aloud. Probably the stress on the existence of a manuscript aims at warranting the accuracy of the many names recorded. One would expect a story told by an Egyptian priest to employ some Egyptian names. We have seen that Solon is said to have translated the names from Egyptian into Greek after the Egyptians had translated names of foreign, presumably Atlantid origin into Egyptian, so that a double process of translation is said to lie behind the forms given by Solon and Plato. In each process, that basic meaning is said to be rendered. The resulting Greek name Atlantis is derived by Plato, like that earlier Greek name Atlantos, meaning sea and sand, denoting the Sahara later adopted for the Atlantic Ocean from the mythical giant Atlas, one of the Titans, who was said to hold up the heaven on his head. Mount Atlas, in the northwest Africa, was similarly regarded as the pillar of heaven, and it is relevant that the Berber word for mountain was Abra. Greek colonist may well have modified this word to Atlas to conform with their mythical giant. If we look for a similar concept in Egypt, the god Shu, who separates earth and heaven, might be a suitable candidate. The four supports of heaven are also an important Egyptian idea. No pointer to Atlantis, however, seems to emerge. A brave attempt to match the concept in Crete has been made by John V. Luce, who is well known as an advocate of the view that Atlantis was Minoan Crete. He also takes the view that Egyptians called Crete Keftiu, and this name he connects with caput and capital, claiming to point also to the use of the Old Testament kaftor of the capital of a pillar. More recently, he has argued that Keftiu is probably derived from a root meaning pillar. He seems to be referring to the word which had, according to the Wörterbuch, Volume 5, 121:14, unhappily only a very tenuous existence. Only one occurrence is recorded. A different approach seems possible, although it belies Plato's stated theory. It is noteworthy that in other instances he does not translate the concepts, but directly follows the Egyptian forms. Thus he mentions the goddess Neith of Sais, Timaeus, 21e, here adding the Greek equivalent Athena. In the Phaedrus, 274 Ceph, he names the god Thoth in the form Theoth, and also the god Ammon of Thebes, in each case avoiding the Greek equivalents Hermes and Zeus. His usual practice, be it noted, is contrary to that of Herodotus, who preaches and practices the theory of equivalences, calling Ammon Zeus and Thoth Hermes. Professor Schenkel has recently proposed a directly Egyptian etymology of Atlantis. He has done this, admittedly in a fairly light-hearted, not to say jocular manner. His proposal is jw.ttrn.s, whose name exists not, who has no name. He explains the second element as the status pronominalis of Coptic Pan, namely Pant. This seems convincing phonetically, in spite of some difficulties, and this idea of namelessness had its attraction for the Egyptians. Accepting the second element, one might yet venture to propose an alternative to the first. Great One is its name. This makes the first element a little easier to derive phonetically, and it suits very well semantically since Plato emphasizes the size of Atlantis. The word is feminine because the feminine, island, as Schenkel points out, was in the New Kingdom replacing the masculine word for the symbolic meaning of a motherland. He may well be the first in over 2,000 years to have proposed an etymology of this kind from Egyptian. If so, I shall have the honor of being the second. In this way, maybe a Glaspellenspiel for Egyptologists has been started. What concerns me mainly, nonetheless, is the extent of the conceptual debt to Egypt. The story certainly does not derive from Egypt in toto. Diverse sources and materials have been used, and the process is patently the construction of a pastiche. The grandiose side of Atlantis shows the impress of the Persian and Hittite empires, especially the elaborate description of the royal city. And in the war against the Greeks and Egyptians, Atlantis also seems to represent a warning to the Persians. Although the picture of military organization has several Greek elements, such as the hoplites and the sailors, while the allotment of land on a military basis is definitely Spartan. Many have reverted to Homer's Trojan War to explain the war chariots, but here is a factor which New Kingdom Egypt might have also provided, unless Persia is again a stronger echoing candidate. As for the elephants and harbour works, they probably point to Carthage, if not lost Egyptian harbours. We have seen that aspects of utopianism in Atlantis recall the Egyptian shipwrecked sailor, especially the idyllic picture of natural abundance. By way of contrast, the larger-scale irrigation in the agricultural system of Atlantis and the transport by water seems likewise to reflect Egypt, although the sophistic hydraulics of the royal city point rather to Babylonia, if not a lost Egyptian round city-state. Again, Atlantis is a holy island, and its first 10 kings are of divine origin as sons of Poseidon. The shipwrecked sailor's island also has a numinous air about it, But more important than this is the tradition that Egypt itself was ruled at first by divine dynasties. Like Atlantis, the sailor's island is to be swallowed up by the waves, the Nile Delta being exceptionally vulnerable to tsunamis. Less tangible are the indications that the rebuttal of the Sea Peoples by Rameses III is mirrored in the Atlantis story. As the Egyptologist Max Pieper suggested, a possible parallel emerges in the help given by Athens to the revolt of Inaros against Persia. The political system of Atlantis is described at first as one headed by a king who has 9 rulers in control of regional units within the country. The impress of the pharaoh and his nomarchs or city rulers is fairly clear here. Egyptian ritual has probably left its mark on the picture of the king as a hunter of wild bulls, as also on the vivid portrayal of the bull sacrifice, and a particularly clear Egyptian detail is the allusion to the procreation of the divine kings of Atlantis in a shrine within the royal palace, with its echo of New Kingdom theology. If Plato in these matters is partly following a Greco-Egyptian tradition about the political situation preceding the accession of Psammetichus I, his immediate source seems to be Herodotus. As for the name Atlantis, it probably derives, as Brandenstein suggests, from a Berber word for mountain, Adra, which the Greeks connected with their Titan Atlas and with Mount Atlas south of Tunis, if not inspired by the pyramids for the Berber languages, were at least related to Egyptian. At the dramatic end of Critias, Plato ascribes the disaster which befell Atlantis to moral causes. Their ideals faded, and they became addicted to unjust ambition and power. This is rather like his condemnation of Persia in the Laws, and it follows broadly the Greek doctrine that hubris is punished by nemesis. We are told too that it was Zeus, the god of gods, who decided to punish them. A similar doctrine is deeply ingrained in the Hebraic thought. It seems that it is not until the time of the Demotic Chronicle that a parallel mode of thought clearly emerges in Egypt, and it may be due to this influence of Israel. Yet, Plato continues to emphasize the divine origin of the rulers of Atlantis, a concept well attested in Egypt. It was the weakening of the divine element, according to him, that brought about lack of moral balance. In one respect, his theory of moral causation is inconsistent, for he seems to have overlooked the fact that, according to a previous statement, Athens suffered the same fate as Atlantis, land of the Garden of Eden, we must ask.